Caledonian Elixir. Broadcasting from Glasgow, Scotland, welcome to the Caledonian Elixir. I'm your host, Vincent Lawler, and we are live to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter X, and Rumble. And you can engage with us by leaving live chats or Rumble rants. And we also set up a server on Discord, so if you want to engage with other viewers of the Elixir crew there after the show, you can. And if you want to support us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. So I hope you're all well. And if you're finding us for the first time, we're a podcast and a live call-in show that covers everything from politics to the paranormal, told with wit and true grit, having on guests and callers. And today on Elixir, we have a special guest, David Knight, joining us in a moment. David Knight as a host of the David Knight Show, the real David Knight Show, delivering news on politics, liberty, and I would say with a religious theme involved. He's also the former host of Infowars, and so he's been on the independent media trenches for a while, and I've been a viewer of his show for many a moon. So I hope he'll help us get to grips with this international interzone of information. So, without, if I will bring him on right now, without further ado, David Knight. Hello, David.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I got you. How about me? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're good. So, where exactly are you joining us from?
From Tennessee, close to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, if people know that area.
Now, how long have you been in Tennessee for?
Been here now for 3 years. Spent most of my life in North Carolina. And except for the time I was in, I grew up in Florida, in Tampa, and then lived for a short period of time in Austin when I was working for Infowars.
And can you tell the audience just a little bit about your background, how you got involved in independent media?
Yeah, it was nothing that I ever planned on doing, quite frankly. I was, by training, I was an electrical engineer, and I did that for about 7 years, and then we struck out on our own. My wife and I started, this is back in the mid-'80s, when video was a big thing, and the video stores that people may remember them, or maybe if you don't remember them, maybe you've seen some pictures of them. But we would get videos, and I was looking the way everybody was doing, running their stores, and they were running them off of 3x5 cards. I thought, I can do a much better job computing with a computer to track inventory than these guys are doing with 3x5 cards. So we really set up the video store as a test case for that. And I wrote a point of sale software for that, and I was going to market it, but the video stores really boomed right about that time. Right about the time we got into it, they stopped fighting the video stores, the studios did, and decided that they would join with the stores for a while. And they lost in the Supreme Court. They tried to stop people from renting videos they'd bought, and they lost in the Supreme Court with the doctrine of first sale. They said, if you sold this to these people, they can do whatever they want to with the tape. They can rent it if they want to. So instead of fighting the stores, the Hollywood studios joined them, and you had that big boom for a short period of time in terms of new releases of animated films and all that kind of stuff. So we were there right through the boom time. So we decided that we weren't going to pursue the software side of it, and did that for a number of years. And then when we sold that business, I started doing video production, because as part of the business, we had 6 stores that we ran, and I had a lot of fun doing movie trailers and doing editing. And there really weren't any tools that I had at the time. It was too expensive to have a nonlinear editor unless you were really in Hollywood or something. Now everybody's got those on their computer, but it was difficult to do it. And but I did it, and we created our own movie trailers for the stores. And after we sold the stores, I continued to do some video production work. that was at a time in the early 2000s when people were having a lot of crowdsourced competitions. And so I started entering contests, and I was pretty successful in the contests as long as it was political and kind of conservative. And so as long as those things were out there, I was getting into those contests. And I entered a contest at Infowars. I didn't win it, but I got hired from it. And that's how I got to Infowars. My political background was I grew up in a family where both my father and both of my grandfathers had their own business. And so I kind of over dinner tables, we'd always hear them talking about the latest obstacle from the government that was going to make their life difficult. and and they were right. That's basically what government does. It gets in the way of people's productive voluntary activities. So I grew up in a kind of a conservative libertarian approach. I was involved in third-party libertarian politics. I ran for Congress at one point in time, but I was also involved in the organization of the party. And so if it was something that was along those lines, I could speak to that pretty easily. And so that was what got me into broadcasting. When I first went, it was to be a reporter, but also to work behind the scenes as a cameraman type of thing. And gradually, I got into some guest hosting that Alex had me do there at Infowars. And then eventually in 2017, he started setting up the other shows. And I was the first show that he set up. I was in the morning. And I did that show from 2017 to 2020 when he fired me. He fired me because I opposed the January the 6th Stop the Steal stuff. I thought it was a grift. I thought it was a trap. And I think I've been proven right. But I also opposed him on the vaccine stuff in the pandemic earlier in the year. And we had a parting of the ways in terms of our support of Trump and our assessment of Elon Musk. And then at that point, I went independent, and I've been independent now for 5 years.
And as I said, I've been a viewer of your show yourself for some time. And what I like about you and your show is you stand against government overreach, whether it's the Obama or the Trump administrations. And you've been consistent in that. And now before I get to what I want, I want to play this short video clip. That's germane to what I want to ask you in a moment. So if you could play clip 1, please.
No side in American politics has a monopoly on disturbed or misguided people. But there's one part of our political community which believes they have a monopoly on truth, goodness, and virtue, and concludes they have also a monopoly on power, thought, and speech. Well, that's not happening anymore. We've turned that corner very quickly. Tragically, atrocities of this kind, and kind that we saw in Utah, of all places, are the eventual consequence of that kind of thinking. If speech is violence, then some are bound to conclude that violence is justified to stop speech. And we're not going to let that be justified.
As you heard from Trump in that clip, no party has a monopoly on disturbed people. But do you think President Trump and his benefactors are trying to achieve a monopoly of power, thought, and speech?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is the thing when we look at it. The left and the right are two wings of the same bird here. And we see that when they're in power, they use exactly the same tactics. I played clips of J.D. Vance talking about how he was against censorship. He did that when he came to Europe and all the rest of the stuff. Now they just flip the other direction. We saw the same thing from Brendan Carr at the FCC. Now, I think actually you want to talk about violence. I think censorship is violence, and it is implied violence. It's done by the government, and the government has a monopoly on violence, or at least claims that they have a right to a monopoly on violence. And so I don't think there is any such thing as hate speech. It certainly is not defined in the Constitution. I think there's people who hate speech. And I think it's interesting. This is one of the things that is so maddening to me is I see various things that Trump has done. And I know that this is a universal agenda of the left, of the globalists and so forth. And they know that the conservatives would typically oppose a particular policy. What they do is they get a conservative leader who will get on board with them, and they use that to push through this agenda. The left, it might be something that the left actually likes, and they're going to support it anyway. We saw this all throughout the pandemic. The left loved the idea that we were going to be mandated to have vaccines. We're going to be told that we have to wear masks and all the rest of the stuff. That we had this system of all these arbitrary rules: do this, don't do that, and they love that. The right does not typically like that, so it was necessary for them to put somebody in that would shut down their opposition to this. And the right has shown that it is perfectly capable of engaging in doublethink, and they make excuses for
Yeah,
this.
to your point, I mean, it was Donald Trump who launched Operation Warp Speed to begin
Mhm.
with. Joe Biden just carried it, didn't he?
That's right. And when I talk to conservatives, a lot of people were mad at me about that. I said it when I was on Infowars, and of course, Alex basically had hitched his wagon to Trump as soon as Trump ran the first time. And so a lot of people who really loved Trump excessively, I believe, and they would say, Trump didn't do it. It was other people who did it. It's just these bad Democrat governors. I can't tell you the number of times I've had people say it was bad Democrat governors who did the lockdown. I said, not at all. You don't understand anything about politics if you don't understand that. The way the thing works here in America is we have this fiat currency, then they can borrow money and never think that they're going to have to pay it back. The only way we're going to pay it back is with the financial collapse of this country. That will eventually happen. But they are free to just print money up, and they can take this magic money and they can reward or punish their friends with it. And we see both parties doing this. Both that you've had Obama, Biden, Trump, all the presidents going back for decades have done this. If they like what you're doing, they will give you more money, and they'll give you grants for things. They'll give you education grants, for example. Obama wanted the transgenders in the girls' bathrooms and gyms. And so he said, if you don't do that, I'm going to take the money away that you've been getting. And then when Trump gets in, he says, if you do that, I'm going to take the money away. So they've got different policies, but they both
I mean, for
use the money.
example, you're alluding to there, hundreds of millions have been slashed to Columbia University, with dozens of others threatened by the Trump administration in regards to anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian and protests.
Exactly. He understands how that works. But back in 2020, a lot of the people who get into MAGA never really followed politics before. They don't understand how this mechanism works. You bribe and you blackmail people with the money that you print in Washington, and that's the way the game works. Harry Truman, in terms of talking about responsibility as a president, he said he had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here. You can't pass the buck anywhere else to anybody else." They didn't understand that. And I said, but that is the principle in which the government operates. And even more so, the buck starts there. The buck starts in Washington. It starts at that president's desk. And he paid people to do these policies. And it wasn't just Democrat governors who were doing it. You had Republican governors who were doing it as well. You had a governor in Ohio who came up with the idea, if you get the vaccine, I'll enter your name into a lottery and you might win $1 million. Of course, you also might get myocarditis and die. But hey, it's like Russian roulette, I said at the time. But we saw this happening with Republicans as well as with Democrats. And yet they wanted to believe, because they're so partisan, that they will project all the faults of Trump and the things that they disagree that Trump does. They'll project it on the Democrats. They'll say that somebody is deceiving him. They'll say that he doesn't really want to do it. Or they say, this is my favorite one.
Or I remember I heard Alex once say that it's because he's a boomer, and boomers grew up with the vaccine. It's what he's used to, and so he's just
he's made a
defending.
million excuses for him.
Yeah.
Alex is also the one who came up with 4D chess idea as well.
And to be fair, I was the one to use that proverbial Trump train. But back when he was running again, in 2024, and you saw him getting shot with the American flag billowing in the background and the blood trickling down his face. That was a very powerful moving scene. And I didn't want to see Joe Biden re-elected. I didn't want to see Kamala Harris elected. And I felt that Trump provided an alternative for Europe, perhaps an alternative that could lead us towards peace. And he has been nothing but a sheer disappointment.
Yeah. Well, what he's done is he's basically gone to war with everybody. Right now it's rhetorical. Who knows if we're going to get into a World War III? You just saw him do a complete 180 at the UN. No longer going to do anything to try to stop the Ukraine war. And that's the way he's been. And I say it all the time. He has no foundation. He has no rudder. He's rudderless. And so he's just like a boat that's blown about by every wind that comes along. And I don't know if he changed his mind, if somebody is blackmailing him or telling him what to do.
Mm.
It's pretty strange when you see somebody just do a complete 180 like that. He didn't offer any reason as to why he would change like that. But it is very difficult. We look at people, and I agree. I looked at when he ran, it was like Hillary Clinton. And I remember that Julian Assange said, we know that Hillary Clinton is a criminal and she's going to get us involved in wars.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know about Trump, but, give him a chance and see what happens. So, well, we saw what happened, and he wound up, they nearly got him executed with Trump's attorney general pushing to have him turned over. So, we do find that we have to go with what people do, not just what they say. When you're running as a candidate, you're free to say anything.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times people look at this, and the best thing that you can do when somebody hasn't been in the office is you can say, okay, well, he's identified the problem, and he sees the problem the same way that I do, and he sees a solution that's going to be the same that I think should happen, or something similar. At least he understands what the problem is. But then after they're in office, you have to
Mm-hmm.
evaluate them based on what they do, not what they say. And that's what's so dangerous about Trump, is he says one thing and he does another.
Yeah, when he was running with that slogan, "Make America Great Again," that platform of prioritizing the interests of the United States. But if you just take, for example, the threat of removing FEMA funding to states that have a boycott on Israel, imposing tariffs on other nations for political reasons,
Yeah.
that's not making America great again. That's not prioritizing the
No.
interest of the United States to cut FEMA funding to states that have a boycott on Israel.
That's right. Yeah, that's where he first went after free speech, was defending Israel against college protests that are out there. And it's not just, the massive amount of money that was at Columbia. Harvard has the largest endowment of any university in any country. And they're getting $9 billion worth of government grants and other things like that. And yet, Trump is not a real conservative. He doesn't want to cut that. He doesn't want to cut subsidizing a private university. He's just fine giving them, unconstitutionally giving them money, as long as they say the things that he likes politically. And he doesn't like the criticism of Israel, or his handlers don't like it. He's going to take the money away from them. And so we're seeing that again, with the TV issues and other things like that. He continues to threaten his enemies, and he does not support free speech in any way, shape, or form. In his first administration, he was talking about taking the licenses of broadcasters who said things that he disagreed with, right? And yet he had an FCC commissioner at the time, Ajit Pai, who said, no, I'm very strong on the First Amendment, and that is not the authority of the FCC. The FCC, I don't believe it has any constitutional authority. I mean, they said we have to have some way that we are going to allocate the frequency spectrums that TV and radio are going to operate on. And all they need to do was to have an auction. I mean, they did have an auction, and they auctioned off these different frequencies to different people. And then they say, now we got to police it, so we got to stick around. But they didn't really need to police it. That could have been handled in the courts privately as a private property issue, as a trespass or something. And it was only a matter of time until you wound up now with an FCC commissioner who says, I'm going to police this based on content. Why should broadcast media like TV and radio have its content examined when you don't examine the content of newspapers, for example? And it's an aberration that should not be there, and is just waiting for somebody to abuse it. And now we got the person who will abuse it.
Well, I mean, over here we have a new online safety law that
I know.
is, I don't want to even get into that, but
Yeah.
it's
Oh, that's
terrible.
amazing.
Do you think Trump is pushing forward a platform that is making America great again, or is he embarking on a sort of safari of strangeness, reacting to just one crisis after another? 'Cause he doesn't seem to be in command right now.
No, it's reactionary, and he doesn't seem to have a plan. And he's rejected the plan that made America great, and that's the Constitution and the rule of law. That's the real issue. And so when you look at what he's doing with these various issues. Just take tariffs, for example. We've always had great relationships with Canada, and he began by taking pot shots at Canada and Greenland and other things like that, making false accusations, false statements about what he was going to do. We've got a situation now because of tariffs. People in Florida who sold a lot of orange juice to Canada, they're seeing that dry up because not only did the Canadians they started booing American teams at hockey games, which is unprecedented, and they put retaliatory tariffs on American products like orange juice. So now orange juice is very, very expensive, even if they wanted to buy American orange juice. Tourism is drying up in Orlando and Vegas because Trump has been so high-handed with people coming here as tourists on visas, as well as his rhetoric that is there. But the most troubling thing about what he's doing with all this, I think, are the tariffs. The idea that the president can unilaterally declare an emergency. And then the idea that if there's an emergency, the president can do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to follow the rule of law. And it's not just the tariffs, it's many other things that are like that.
And that's been weighed up right now by the Supreme Court over there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about to be heard by the Supreme Court in terms of the tariffs. They're going to rule on whether or not that's a legitimate use of that law that I forget what the acronym actually stood for. It's IEEPA. It's IEEPA. And it's something about the Emergencies Act. But I don't think he's got a case in terms of that act, and I think that'll be overthrown. They're trying to say that it stands on the Major Questions Act, and they said, well, we don't have to abide by the Major Questions Act, which is not really anything that's in the Constitution. That was a rule that came up with the Supreme Court. I think the real issue is the Constitution says what it says. It's not complicated, and the court comes up with its own other standards, but that standard is not going to be something that he can get around, I don't think, because it's the same standard by which they shut down Biden for giving all the student loans in order to buy votes. They said, you don't have the authority to do that. That's a major issue, and you can't undertake that without going to Congress. And so on that basis, they shut it down. Well, that certainly is the case with the tariff.
What do you think was behind that, I don't even know what you would call it, that ambition of the Trump administration, of Trump himself, to annex Canada and Greenland, to bring them into, the United States? Do you think that was a sincere, legitimate ambition? Or
no, I think the man thrives on theatrics. Are you familiar with WWE wrestling that we have here in America?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, you know that he was big friends with the guy who owned that, McMahon. Yeah. And even put his wife, Linda McMahon, in charge of the Department of Education. Trump himself showed up at some of these events and was involved in these fake fights and stuff like that. I think he learned that nothing succeeds like conflict. And, many people have said nothing succeeds like excess. That's kind of the American thing. And he wants excessive conflict and fights. And that's the thing that really drives him. And it's one of the things that I think is really destroying America and may push us into a civil war. I think that is the agenda in every country. They want to create problems, and they want to create competing groups of people in every country so that they'll fight each other instead of understanding who the real enemy is at the top. But when you look at the things that he's done, so many things that he threw out there, like Canada and saying that fentanyl was coming through Canada. It's not coming through Canada. Everybody knew that. And he got everybody, he controlled the news cycle like that. The only time that he's really lost control of the news cycle is on the Epstein documents. And he just didn't have a leg to stand on with that. And he's done his best to do it. I'm just worried that he's going to start another war to get people away from the Epstein documents, because it's already been done by Bill Clinton. He got us involved. He got a bomb in Serbian war because, distract people from what was going on with Monica Lewinsky. I think Trump is absolutely capable of doing that. So I think it was all just theater. He throws these things out there and he gets everybody talking about the straw man that he has set up there while he's doing something else that is really dangerous. He doesn't want them seeing that. Or maybe it's some personally dangerous or embarrassing thing for him, and he wants to distract everybody. But he always wants to stay in front of the media, and it is exhausting to see this guy constantly coming up with one scandalous thing after the other.
And again, it's not just the scandals. There's the gaslighting there to say that the Epstein it's a hoax. And to see Ghislaine Maxwell, who's been charged over
Yeah.
trafficking, etc., have be moved to a a site that is a lot more comfortable.
Oh yeah, call it Club Fed. It's like
Yeah,
a country
yeah,
club. Yeah. It's
and
like a
there's
country
so
club, you just can't leave. Of course, Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to leave on a daily basis. He'd just have to come back and sleep in the cot at night, and they'd call that a day in jail.
yeah, and you've seen the ambassador to the United States, the British ambassador Peter Mandelson, recently let go over his connections to Epstein, and he wrote essentially a get well card to Epstein when he was charged with, in 2008. And at the same time, we've seen Trump recently on his second state visit to the UK, sitting at Windsor Castle with the king and the doyen of the British society, echoing their hawkish anti-Russian views.
Yeah.
That's probably a good point to transition to what's taking place over in Europe in
Yeah.
regards to
It is
NATO.
amazing. I talked about the fact that what's her name? Andrew's wife, Ferguson or Fergie or whatever.
Yeah,
She was kicked out of some charities because she had said something nice about Jeffrey Epstein. Well, he's said a lot of nice things about Jeffrey Epstein. He said a lot of nice things about Ghislaine Maxwell. I wish her well and all the rest of the stuff. Put her in Club Fed. And yet nothing happens to Donald Trump. Even amongst his base, you got a lot of people who are still defending him over that. He was best friends with Epstein for like 15 years. They hang out all the time. I said before they kind of came up with the idea that he was an informant to the FBI, I said, if you look at these guys, they were fast and close friends, the closest of friends. They were always together, always having parties and all the rest of the stuff for 15 years. Then they fought over a piece of property in Mar-a-Lago. And shortly after that, an anonymous tip turned in Jeffrey Epstein. And that's when he had that case that he was ultimately convicted of, but they basically did a non-prosecution agreement because you had Alex Acosta, who was the prosecutor there, that he was told to lay off of him. He's intelligence. That's the way he explained it. Isn't it interesting that Trump, that all happened at the same time? And now you had Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, say, well, Trump was an informant against Epstein for the FBI. It's like, okay, well, if he was an informant, how was this a hoax then? He was an informant of a hoax? None of that hangs together. They don't have they have the logic to lie about
Well,
any of this stuff.
he's definitely covering for someone or a group of individuals or himself or all of
Well,
the
I think
above.
that informant stuff, I think that was just him getting revenge on Epstein. That was the thing that broke up their friendship. And I think that was him getting revenge on Epstein at that point in time. I think he turned him in. But think about the fact that how close he is with all this. And think about the fact that he picks this local prosecutor, Alex Acosta, to be his Secretary of Labor. That's why Alex Acosta said he was told to lay off of Epstein because he was intelligence. They were questioning him as he's being put in the Trump cabinet. Why does he have all these people around him that are such close friends with Jeffrey Epstein? And then you got Alan Dershowitz, who was the defending lawyer for Jeffrey Epstein, and now a very close defender of Donald Trump. But the other person that was on the defense team was Ken Starr. He was supposed to be the Republican guy who was going to look into the Clintons. And basically, he let them off of virtually every charge that was there. There were all kinds of charges regarding financial corruption and selling of influence and secrets, as well as the sexual stuff. And there were a lot of allegations of sexual assault and rape. And instead, Ken Starr put all that off the table, and he focused on a consensual affair that he had with Monica Lewinsky, which was not really a criminal charge. He tried to make it a criminal charge by saying, well, he said he didn't do it, so he committed perjury. But he took the big criminal charges of bribery, corruption, rape, sexual assault. He moved all those off the table and focused on that one thing. Then Ken Starr goes to defend Jeffrey Epstein, of all things. And this is, I think, Ken Starr is a good example of how the different political parties will gaslight the public.
Yeah. And as you alluded to there with Fergie, I think she was a patron of many children's charities over here. I mean, how sickening and ironic is that? Okay, if you could play clip 2, it's just going to transition over to what is taking place right now between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO?
Macron talks about possible deployment of foreign military in Ukraine. Do you think that the full-scale conflict between Russia and NATO, is it possible? Is it realistic? I think anything is possible in today's world, and it's clear to everyone this would be one step from a full-scale World War III. I don't think people would be interested in that. As for the French president, I think there are some corrections to the statements that there would be the personnel would be doing some secondary.
David, here's how I see it. It's as if Trump has a foot in each side. You know, on the one hand, there's a position of the Europeans and Zelensky, which is a ceasefire first, then negotiations, followed by a coalition of the willing boots on the ground. And the Russian position is essentially a comprehensive peace deal that deals with, contends with the underlying problems of the conflict, what caused it. So no ceasefire and definitely no boots on the ground, but it's the Russian position. And we've seen Trump, you know, after the Alaska summit, echo Putin's position that there shouldn't be a ceasefire first. We should have an underlying comprehensive peace agreement. But then he says that this should be followed by boots on the ground. So it's as if he's taking the position of Europe one moment, then taking the position of Russia the next. And
a lot of people have looked at him and said he echoes the position of the last person they talked to.
Perhaps, yeah. So
yeah,
I mean,
it is dangerous.
Yeah. So, do you think Trump has any real strategy to end the war, or is he again just reacting to what Zelensky's doing, what Putin's saying, and where do you think the trajectory? Where do you think this war's going?
Well, I'll pull back and take a look. In the U.S., there was a couple guys, the names of Strauss and Howe, and they wrote a book in the early 90s called Generations. And people will still use those labels like millennial. That was something that they coined, boomers and other things like that. And then 2 years later, about 1993, I think it was, they came up with a book called Fourth Turning. They went back through American and British history for 500 years. And they said about every 80 years, about every 4 generations, you have a major restructuring of society in one way or the other. Politically, the institutions are viewed by the people as hopelessly corrupt. And usually, it said always there's economic unrest that is there. And it is almost always, not every case, but almost always followed with a war. And when they got to the United States, they said, well, you know, the previous Fourth Turning was World War II, the Great Depression. Prior to that, you had the Civil War. Prior to that, you had the American Revolution. And they said, when they wrote it in the early 90s, they said, according to their reckoning, they thought sometime around the mid-2000s, there'd be some kind of a global economic issue that would begin the Fourth Turning, and of this particular Fourth Turning. And then later they said, and we think it'll probably last till about 2029. Isn't it interesting that all of these globalist organizations use 2030 as the starting point of their new world order, right? And they all use the terms of these different generations, but they don't talk to the public about the general premise of this cyclical view of history. And so I think that in the bigger scheme of things, I think that's what we're seeing here. Certainly, I'm not of the position that great men or individual people that have a lot of influence and power and charisma or whatever.
Sorry for interrupting. So when you speak of a cyclical change, are you alluding to it being natural, or do you think it's been imposed on us by these organizations?
I think in terms of what their premise was that it was people were predisposed to fall into that category. And I think there's a combination of both a cyclical view of history and the great man view of history. I think both of those things are true. I think a lot of the great men will sense where they are in this cycle of history, and they will exploit it. And I think that's what's being done by the globalists right now. I think they understand fully well that when you have a generation that wins a war, they have a certain that fights a war and wins it. They have a certain attitude that is different than the generation that comes after them. They come at a time of peace and that type of stuff, and prosperity. They enjoy that, and then you go through this cycle for each of these generations. And they talked about it in many different instances, how the generation that had the war, then you have their children, their grandchildren, and so forth, and how each of them is raised in a different type of society with a different attitude. And so I think that is something that has a large bearing on the zeitgeist, if you will, what the general population is feeling. And then I think you have these individuals who come along and they're able to exploit that. And I think that's the time that we're in right now. I have Gerald Celente on many times. He has an economic publication called Trends Journal. And one of his favorite things to say is that when all else fails, they take you to war. And I think that's one of the reasons why you typically see wars happening in these fourth turnings. And I think that there is a great deal of engineered problems by these people. And I think they've been looking to have a major, major, major fourth turning right now. I think they're looking to overthrow everything and create a global government with the kind of digital ID and stuff that you're fighting over now in the UK. And I'll just say this, in the UK, it's being presented by Keir Starmer, but here in the United States, for exactly the same reason, we've had it presented by conservative Republicans. You had DeSantis and there were conservative Republicans in Florida who came up with the idea that because we got an immigration problem, we're going to solve that with E-Verify, and we're going to make it mandatory. E-Verify has been around for a while, but it wasn't mandatory. And so what they say, well, we're going to make that mandatory. You got to prove that you're a citizen, prove your identity before you can get a job to us. That's the way they bring these things in. We've had E-Verify and we've had Real ID around, and they're now bringing these things into a kind of a mandatory status. Mandatory if you want to travel, mandatory if you want a job, various other things like that. And so it's interesting, I think, and the same type of thing that we saw in 2020. You could have somebody like Trump in America and Trudeau in Canada, but they're doing exactly the same thing, which makes no sense whatsoever. They were all in lockstep with each other. It didn't matter what the declared ideology was of the political party. They could be supposedly completely different. You could have the communists versus the conservatives, and they were all doing the same thing with the COVID stuff. And you're seeing the same thing starting to happen now with digital ID. Everybody is rushing with digital ID or with CBDC or some other form of digital money. Here in the United States, they're pushing stablecoin. But stablecoin has all of the insidious features of CBDC from a privacy and surveillance standpoint. It has all the capabilities that CBDC does. They're just relabeling it here in the United States, just like instead of pushing it through with a Democrat, they'll push it through with Trump. And the people who would oppose
this march towards mass biotelemetry is something that's been going on for a while. I remember reading Ted Kaczynski's book, what is it, Industrial Society?
Right.
And he was referring to that. And Tony Blair, he would try to introduce this digital ID card over in the UK 20 years ago, but, he lost power. So it's not new, but I've heard you say yourself, we don't have global government, but we have global governance.
That's right.
And
that's right.
That's
They're going to maintain the illusion of different countries because
Mm-hmm.
that suits their control narrative. They don't want people freaking out about it. They don't want to have something that people can organize against. So they'll pretend that you have independent sovereign nations when in reality they're all marching in lockstep toward the same goal. That's global governance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of sleight of hand, a trick that is taking place in the UK where the mainstream media, whether it's on the left or on the right, it doesn't matter. They're always misdirecting everyone to look at illegal immigration. That if you're looking at the boats, I think around about 50,000 people, illegal immigrants, come across the channel on boats a year over here, but 1 million come over legally. 1 million every year. So it's a sort of sleight of hand misdirection, and I kind of ask everyone, wait a minute, they're bringing in this digital ID to stop around 50,000, yet they're providing $1 million every year.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it
Here,
seems.
the legal immigrants are H-1B visas, and that was supposed to bring in people who had some specialized skill, like in technology or something like that. And yet, that's not the way that's being used. They've uncovered massive corruption of employment agencies who had worked with the corporations to keep job openings quiet and concealed from the American public, so they could then make a case that they couldn't fill it, and then bring in people
Mhm.
from India at a very cheap rate to replace American jobs. And that really is a more devastating thing. That's more devastating than offshore manufacturing to onshore labor, especially at the top end, which is what they are doing. So you're right. It is a misdirection that is there. And we're seeing the same types of strategies in every country. And
Let
so
me
the
ask
people
you. Let me ask you, because I had this conversation with a friend of mine recently, and I think the reason, and may be wrong, there are many reasons involved, but I think a main reason that the government is doing this, that is bringing in so many migrants, is because of the demographic shortage we have in the UK. I don't know the exact number. I think it's between 1% and 2%.
Mhm.
And I think that it's something like 2.5 to 3%. You need um, to um,
to be able to
if
maintain a
all between,
population.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So do you think that's the reason, or is there something else going on? Because if there is like that demographic shortfall, and there is a growing elderly population,
Mhm.
the governments across Europe especially, they do have to contend with that.
Yeah, yeah, but I think that if you go back and look, I think this stuff all started back in the 1960s. The globalists were talking a great deal about depopulation. This is the generation of the parents of Bill Gates and others. There was a guy called Paul Ehrlich here. He was he's one of the main people starting Earth Day and things like that. But he began by being a depopulationist. And if you look at the green agenda, it's primarily focused on we got too many people and the people are destroying the planet, that type of thing. It's this real Malthusian perspective. And they have been anti-population, and you see this embedded throughout our culture, throughout our food, throughout our drugs, everything. We don't want to have kids. And then if you escape that behavioral programming, then you may have physical issues in terms of being able to have kids, because we've seen that there has been what some people call a spermageddon, dramatic drop in
Mhm.
fertility. And so there's multiple factors like that. They can bring in people who have not been subject to whatever the environmental things or the food and drugs or whatever it is that's having the physical effect on us. Bring them in from another country where they haven't had that physical effect. Bring them in from another country where they haven't poisoned the relationship between men and women, and they want to have
Mhm.
families and they want to have children. So that's one aspect of it. But I think predominantly when you go back and you look at what these people want to do, it's always been about depopulation, and it's always been about keeping people under control. And you do that by divide and conquer. And if you bring in large numbers of people and a foreign culture, maybe even a foreign language, who are not going to easily mix in and assimilate. When people come in small numbers, they mix in with the group that's there. And we used to call America the melting pot, and that's the way it used to work. But if you bring people in large enough numbers, these different ethnic groups remain distinct. They keep their culture, they keep their language, and now you've got a friction that's going to be there. And I think they saw there in the overall picture of this, when you look at what the technocracy wants to do. We had when Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, and of course he was very big in the environmental thing. He and Sadiq Khan were a couple of co-founders of this C40 thing. It's supposed to be 40 cities. It's now over 100 of them that have come in, and they have very stringent goals. They want to make sure that you don't buy more than 3 articles of clothing a year, something like that. That once every 3 years you're able to take a trip of no more than 900 miles on a plane. No cars, no meat, on and on. They've got all these different things, these different rules that they have signed on to at the C40. And Michael Bloomberg, billionaire in his own right, he was mayor of New York at the time. When he ran I think it was in 2020, when he ran for president, he said that, or maybe it was 24, he insulted farmers. He said, farmers, anybody can do that job. And everybody in the conservative press just had a fit. Look at that. He insulted farmers. They have a pretty difficult job to do, especially with today's technology. They got to be a jack of all trades and so forth. It wasn't about that. If you read his actual quote, he said, we had farmers and we had a revolution. And then, everybody started working in the factories. And he said, but now the smart ones of us are figuring out how we're going to take everybody's jobs and the farms and the factories and so forth. And he said, we're going to have to figure out how we keep them from coming after us with guillotines. That was his words. And he said, we're going to have to do it with universal basic income. In other words, they're going to take your job. They're going to make sure that you have nothing, you own nothing, right? But you also have no prospects in the future. And that's a very dangerous thing for them to do. They've got to find a way to placate you. And that's what they have. Yuval Noah Harari at the World Economic Forum, he always talks about that. He says, yeah, we're going to give people video games and we're going to give them drugs and sex and all so that they don't mess with us and we can do whatever we want. They have to pacify the population, and they have to make the population smaller, because if it's too large, the law of averages are that you're going to have somebody and a few people who are going to rise up and oppose them, maybe replace them. So they want a small population. They want everybody under control. I think that's the overall picture. And when I saw what was happening in 2020, when Trump did the lockdown, I said, he's conditioning everybody for universal basic income. It really hit the small businesses. You had Main Street was just devastated. All these small businesses closing. And he said, they're not essential. We're going to keep the essential businesses open. By that, he meant the big box retailers off of Wall Street and that type of thing. And then he hands out a stimulus check to everybody. And I said, this is just predictive programming, an acclamation for this universal basic income. Elon Musk, the first person he gave any money to was Andrew Yang, whose run for president was focused strictly on UBI at the beginning. He later on branched out into some other topics. I saw when he threw his hat in the ring, and I'd been talking about universal basic income for quite some time. And so I offered for him to come on and do an interview when I was at Infowars, and he agreed. And then he canceled at the last minute because I was ready to talk to him about universal basic income. But I think that's where this is going. They want to pacify and control everybody.
I mean, that was prevalent across all Europe too. And in respect to the farming that you brought up and the mass migration, when I first became conscious of how the farmers were being punished when there were farmers' protests all across the Netherlands, how there were thousands of acres of farmland being expropriated by the Dutch government. And when I lived in the Netherlands in a city called Utrecht for a while, and the area in which I lived in, you described it perfectly when you said there are many different groups that just didn't interact, and the native Dutch people were, at the time I thought and I felt they were quite racist because they were very insulated and they had a hostile view towards the other groups that seemed very prevalent in the area, such as the Moroccans and the Turks. And I lived in a community that was basically owned and run by Moroccans. And it took not that long for me to discover the reality of the situation, that they did not take too kindly to my presence, being a white man living in a community that was dominated by Moroccans. So you had this condition, this state of affairs in the Netherlands where you had three main communities that were just fighting off one another, and the Dutch government was just feeding into it. And now you're seeing this sort of balkanization of all, across Europe with different ethnicities, but they just don't seem to integrate and interact with one another.
That's exactly what it is. It's a deliberate policy of balkanization. They understand that, people come together in terms of language and culture and things like that. That's why we have nations, for those very reasons. And if they want to break apart a nation, that's the easiest way that you can do it. One person comes in from another area, or one or two, they will match that area. They have to assimilate. And we used to talk about America being the melting pot. You have these different ingredients that come in and they join the whole and they add their contribution to the whole. Now the metaphor is more like a tossed salad. All these ingredients remain their distinctive thing. And there's conflict in that. And they want that deliberately. You talked about the Netherlands. And of course, Mark Rutte was trying to shut down all these farms, even criminalizing bringing in fertilizer and stuff like that. And as they kicked him out, where did he go? they put him in
Yeah.
charge of NATO, right? The perfect
Mhm.
place for a globalist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I heard someone sum up the state of conflict in Ukraine as a competition between what can hold out longer or what will break first, the Russian economy or the Ukrainian military. But what's
Mhm.
not included in that analysis is the state of the European economies. I mean, it's like we're committing economic suicide in Europe. We had cheap Russian energy being provided to us. Now we're sanctioning that or blowing up the pipelines and
Mhm.
instead bringing in more expensive American LNG, or we're bringing in renewables. And as you
Mhm.
know, with inflation, the biggest driver of inflation is, energy. So if
Yes.
we've got expensive energy, we're going to have high inflation. And our economies over here are flatlining. We just saw the French government, the French parliament collapse over essential welfare reforms. The British economy, that's stagnating. Yet
Mhm.
we're able to provide Ukraine up to 3 to 5 billion every year. I think that's been
Yeah.
pledged by the Starmer government, 3 to 5 billion every year for 100 years. Um, that's mad.
Mhm.
Then we had Chancellor Merz of Germany recently announced that 9 billion is to be sent to Ukraine. But on the same day he announced that, he said that welfare in Germany can't continue. So welfare for Ukraine can continue, but
Yeah.
not for the German people.
That's
So
right.
I don't understand why the do you think the elites in Europe are just really detached, essentially existing in a separate civilization bubble, and they don't understand the effects of our policies? Or
Well,
is
I
it
think
more
they know
like
what they're
we're
doing. Yeah,
sorry?
I think it's deliberate.
Deliberate.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. If you go back and you look, some of the other things, if you go back to look at Jimmy Carter's presidency, right, in the last half of the 70s, the guy that was really running the show there, just like Henry Kissinger ran the show for Richard Nixon, the guy that was running the show in the Carter administration was Zbigniew Brzezinski. His daughter is still a big commentator in American media,
Mhm.
Mika Brzezinski. Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages. And he said, in the coming technocratic age, he was talking about the technocracy, right? And he was talking about how they're going to know everything that you're going to do before you do it. They're going to track and trace everything. He's describing the surveillance police state that they're putting in place. That was in the very, very early 80s. He was also somebody who wanted to create a global governance by merging economically these different regions. And he was later put into the leadership of the Trilateral Commission before he became the guy that was running the Carter presidency. And so, we would have North America, then we would have Europe, and we would have Asia. And so you got these three different trade blocks. And then what you do is you start making trade treaties between them, like the transatlantic partnership and the Trans-Pacific partnership that we're doing. They were basically, if those things had gone through, they were going to essentially join these three different groups together economically. And that's the pattern that they followed in Europe. First, you had a common market, and then you start getting closer and closer economically on things. And then they go to a common currency, and then they go to political union and things like that.
Mhm.
That's why I think that Klaus Schwab and his people, they openly tip their hat to say it's the World Economic Forum, right? We got to unify. If we want world government, we first have to do it economically, then we do it politically, then we do it militarily with a boot stomping on your face. That's the
Yeah.
pattern that they use each time.
Yeah, it's kind of like look but don't touch, and it's like touch but don't taste, and then it's like
Mhm.
taste but don't swallow, But you know, but for me, when I look at these political elites like Stammer, Merz, Macron, to me, or Tusk and Rutter, to me, it's like they're like gamblers at a casino wheel, and they have
Mhm.
put down so much they can't walk away. They can't walk away and go back to the wife, go back to the kids, and say, "Look, by the way, I've lost so much." So now I'm worried that we're getting ready to put down the house. We're going to use the house, our
That's right.
own, and we're the house. That's what concerns me. They can't walk away from Project Ukraine. He can't
Mhm.
admit it's failed, but they wanted to use Ukraine as a battering ram to basically topple Vladimir Putin and
That's right.
the government in Russia to basically acquire the resources over there, the tens of trillions that the Russian Federation has.
I think
And so
NATO
what
is
do we
very
do?
dangerous. I think NATO was created to balance out the Soviet Union, right? And when the Soviet Union fell, it's like, oh, now what do we do? Well, let's take on Russia. This is our opportunity to destroy Russia. And, they did that with the wars in the 90s and so forth, and then moving relentlessly step by step towards this confrontation. And I don't see NATO as a good actor. Anybody who thinks that they are good actors should go back and read up on Operation Gladio and see how the NATO Left Behind network organized itself into a terrorist network, an idea that they were going to fight against communism. But they're just a bunch of gangsters. And it's a very dangerous game that they're playing. And I think that they want war for depopulation. It's one of the things that Paul Ehrlich said. He said, so how do we get depopulation? We're going to have birth control. We can have abortion. We can discourage people from having families and things like that, because you're not even, he said, it would be good if we had some kind of a pandemic or something, but you're not really going to get there unless you got war. War is the way that you can really control the population. And it's a way that if you want to reset the board and you want to take everything down for a great reset, there's no better way to do it than with a war.
If that's the case, do you think the leadership in Russia is also involved in that globalist agenda?
Yeah, I would not be surprised at all. I mean, these people in power, Putin used to go to all their confabs, right? All their parties. I've got a video that I played a couple of times of him singing Fats Domino's thing. I
Found
found my
my
thrill.
thrill
Yeah, exactly.
on blueberry. Yeah.
But the thing that I find interesting is there's a politician in Ukraine, Alexei Arestovich, and Zelensky was elected in 2019 on a platform of peace. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
And at that point in time, there had 5 years of civil war, because you had the different areas that wanted to stay associated with Russia because of language and culture and other things like that. Did not like, for whatever reason, Kiev, and did not want to be under Kiev's rule. So there was civil war. They were fighting, bombing these civilian areas. And he was the peace negotiator, Alexei Arestovich. And when he came back and went on to Ukrainian television, the interviewer asked him, she said, what are the chances of peace? And he goes, not good at all. She goes, oh, that's bad. And he goes, no, it's going to get worse. He said, and this was 2019, he said, in 3 years, we're going to be at war with Russia. She goes, and he said, and the entire country is going to be destroyed. She said, that's horrible. And he goes, yeah, but we get into NATO. That's the good thing about it. That was his overall reach. And the guy has been amazing in terms of how candid and frank he is about things. And it got him fired because at one point in time, if you remember early on in the war, they had some Russian cruise missiles. They claimed that Russia had targeted a civilian apartment building. And Arestovich went on and he said, well, no, actually, we hit that cruise missile and then it veered off course and hit that apartment building. And so when he contradicted the official narrative and told the truth, kind of, bluntly told the truth, they fired him. So he has a history of just telling people what's going on for whatever reason.
We recently had that incursion into Polish airspace, allegedly of 1920 Russian drones, then the incursion into Romanian airspace, allegedly for Russian drone, then the MiG-31s over Estonian airspace. Again, all been, having the finger pointed at Russia. But what makes me suspicious about this is there is precedence for Ukraine using false flags so that NATO and Russia end up in a direct clash. If you look at 2022, there was that errant interceptor that fell into Poland, killed a couple of Polish citizens, and Zelensky came out immediately blaming the Russians and calling for NATO to essentially get involved in the game, get involved in the war. Thank
They're
God
looking for
that,
any kind of provocation. Yes.
yeah, and thank God that instead the Polish, proceeded with an investigation and didn't declare Article 5. However, Zelensky must have been well aware, because the radars, everything, that this was a Ukrainian interceptor. So if that is the case, and then you take what has happened this year with the operation that what do you call it? One where they used the drones in Russia, launched from freight trains, and targeted the Russian bombers, the nuclear bombers.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, that's
so
devastating.
again, yeah, so we have these precedents where Ukraine can create a false flag to
Yes.
escalate tensions between the NATO countries and Russia. And I'm looking at what's happening between, the Balkans, the states and all across Eastern Europe, from Romania to Poland, are arguing, alleging that Russia is, you know, getting
Well, I'll tell you
involved.
what, if they can trick us into a war based on these stories, we deserve to die, I guess. I talked about these two incidents today. First of all, the drones, the most recent incidents of the drones at the airports. We had a situation like that about a year and a half ago here in the United States, or all over the eastern United States.
Yeah.
And it's like, what's going on with all this stuff? And it was a regular thing every night, and they never got that figured out. Maybe it had something to do with this thing. But when they flew these drones over the airport in Copenhagen, they were doing it in a harassment campaign. They turned the lights on to make sure that you saw them. Same thing was happening in the east coast of the U.S. as well when that was happening. But they mentioned that they have about 40 of these incidents a year have had 40 incidents like this over the past 10 years. So about 4 of them a year. Why then would we go to war with this? It makes absolutely no sense. And when you look at the drones going into Poland, that was also a deliberate false flag attack. Donald Tusk, who has he's a part of the globalist cabal, he tried to mislead even his counterparts there in Poland. He has a coalition government with another guy that is not, that party is not pushing for war like Donald Tusk is. And there was one home that was severely damaged or destroyed by a falling object. They said that it was one of these drones, but when they inspected it, they found that it was one of the missiles that was fired by one of the intercepting jets that not only missed, but was a dud and didn't blow up when it hit the house. Donald Tusk knew that when he sold the false lie that it was one of these drones. But the other part of it is the fact that these drones are decoy drones. They're not there with any weapons. They don't have any controlling ability. So these are drones that they failed to shoot them down in Ukraine. They kept going, or they got confused with the electronic warfare. They penetrated about 500 kilometers in, but they were not really attack drones. And what is really amazing and scary when you stop and think about it is how incompetent Ukrainian defenses were, how incompetent the Polish defenses were. They scrambled jets to shoot at them, but they missed them. And then the missiles that missed these decoy drones failed to explode in this particular case. So the whole thing was a comedy of errors. And I hope that
it's a complete mess. I mean, if you look at what's
is.
happening in Moldova at the moment, it's a perfect picture, a perfect portrait of elections in Europe now, where you have a pro-Russian party and a pro-EU party, and at the same time there's conscription. So because there's an election, we need conscription because they're afraid that there's going to be so much chaos in the streets. Okay, I just want to transition over to the Middle East. Just one last question before we wrap this up. So in the last 12 months, we have seen Israel attack, of course, there's got Gaza and the West Bank. We've seen Israel attack Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, Syria,
Exactly.
Qatar now. And the Syria thing may have been just an extension of Operation Sycamore. Now you've got al-Jawlani, a former head of ISIS, former chief of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, now the leader of Syria, which is madness. And what did Trump say about al-Jawlani? He's a handsome man, apparently. But so you've seen 6 or 7 states attacked by Israel in the last 12 months. A UN Council committee has said that they think it's an alleged genocide. So the whole thing over there is a complete mess. What do you think is going to happen in respect with Israel and Iran in the upcoming months? Because there's a lot of talk about a second war happening.
I think we'll give a Nobel Peace Prize to Donald Trump. I think that's what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because he's been such a man of peace. Netanyahu has been after Iran forever. 20 years ago, he was doing that cartoon bomb presentation they did and that became a meme. And so he's wanted to go after Iran this entire time. And so for the last 2 or 3 decades, we've been told that Iran is just days away from a nuclear weapon that they're going to use against Israel. Never happened. A lot of people don't understand the history of America with Iran. And that Islamic State that is there is our creation. It was blowback. I first came across that when I was in college. I was in engineering, and we had a lot of Iranian students at the time. This is before the revolution. And they were having protests on our campus. The Iranians were protesting. I thought, why are they protesting us here? I didn't realize our involvement in Iran. I didn't realize at the time that we had overthrown their elected government that was going to nationalize some of the oil companies in the 1950s as Mossadegh. I think it's like 1952, if I remember correctly. And then they installed the Shah of Iran, and the CIA trained his ruthless secret police, the Savak. So I started talking to some of the students that were there, and I asked them, because they were wearing balaclavas, masks, and stuff in the protest, and that was unheard of at that point in time. And so, what's this about? And said, well, we have to do that because the Savak is looking, and if they see who we are, they will arrest, torture, and possibly kill our family. And they're trained by your CIA. It's like, no, I thought we were the good guys, So this is one of these. The 2 British comedians, I don't remember the name, but the one guy, they're dressed up as Nazis, and the one guy says, hey, Hans, are we the bad guys here?
Mitchell and Webb.
Yeah. That's a brilliant comedy routine, but that's really where we are. That's kind of the wake up moment that so many people have. That was kind of my wake up moment. Wait a minute, maybe we're the bad guys.
Why have we got skulls on our collars?
Exactly. Yeah,
dressed in all donned in black.
That's right. Americans have no sense of what happened with America and Iran prior to the Ayatollahs coming in. Now, I'm not saying the Ayatollahs are good guys, not at all. But that's a monster that we created. And so the U.S. has a lot involved in all of that. And Netanyahu has been wanting to get the U.S. to come after Iran. And of course, we've had Trump assassinate their number 2 guy and boast about it. And he doesn't need a lot of encouraging to come over to their side and bomb facilities for them as well. So I think that is a very real possibility. I know that they are, the Islamic Republic, especially if you live there, is ruthless as well. But it is a thing that we have created. And that's why our policy, every time we go these different places and do regime change and we do asymmetric warfare, we just keep making things worse all the time. So is that going to happen? I would say probably, because Israel really owns the U.S. government. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Trump doesn't even try to hide it. He even said in the previous term, he said, Congress used to be owned by the Israelis, and rightfully so, he said. How could you say that about any foreign country, that they rightfully should own our own government? And he was saying that in order to curry favor with the Israelis, by saying that, I'm your guy.
Sorry for interrupting. What was it Mark Huckabee said recently, that Israel was the wife of the United States?
Did he really?
Yeah.
The wife that tries to kill you.
Yeah, and what to me, if you're pro-Israel, it doesn't make sense to me that you would want a conflict, a war with Iran. We saw at the beginning of the war, I think it was Operation Lionheart, is that what it was called? Anyway, at the beginning, you had Netanyahu and Trump call for the overthrow of the Ayatollah. They called for immediate surrender. And within 12 days, you had Trump call for a ceasefire. It wasn't Iran that called for the ceasefire. It was Trump. And we saw the port of Haifa in Israel being bombed every day, so they couldn't get supplies. And we saw Ben Gurion airport closed for many days. We saw the stockpiles of interceptors for Israel run out. I've heard it said that within a few days we were going to run out of interceptors. So when you look at the devastation that caused on both sides, why would you want round 2?
Yeah, there's a kind of hubris that you see with people who start wars. Both sides always think they've got the upper hand. But one of the things that is always there, whether you're talking about Ukraine versus Russia, or you're talking about Israel versus Iran, size matters, and quantity is its own quality, isn't it? And so when you got a small country that's trying to take on a vast country with a lot bigger population, all the rest of it doesn't matter if you've got some kind of a qualitative edge over them. Things are going to come out that way in the end, unless you just want to do the nuclear option. But if we are, if Israel is our wife, I want a divorce.
Okay, David. I'll wrap this up then. But just before you go, is there anything you'd like to promote or tell the audience about before you?
I'll just tell them where the show is. You can find our website at davidknight.news, and that will show you where we broadcast. It has links to where we broadcast. We're on Rumble and BitChute and Odyssey and Twitter. We broadcast on live, and we're live Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. Eastern time to noon Eastern time. So there's some links to where you can find us and that type of thing. So it's everywhere we got it up. It's free to watch. We don't have it behind a paywall. We just operate on voluntary support and on a little bit of merchandise that we sell.
Okay, David, it's been good speaking to you. And I'll be sure to...
Thank you, Vincent. Appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And that was David Knight, people, from the Real David Knight Show. I recommend you check it out. Very informative and clued up guy. So next week we have on Richard Kinsella. He is an author who specializes on AI. So he'll be coming on Monday, I believe, to discuss with us his views on artificial intelligence. And also Black projects that are related to ET. So that should be interesting, and that is on Monday. And if you liked our show, you can support us at Buy Me a Coffee. That is buymeacoffee.com/Caledonian Elixir. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. So until next time, I shall catch you later.
Gold pressed platinum, slip strips and bars. If you ever find some, you can lose it in quarts. Get a Ractogino, spin the double wheel. Order a black hole, just depends how you feel. Yeah, it just depends how you feel. Gold pressed platinum, you know it's a gas. Mom vomits it up into a tiny little glass. Liquid platinum, more you amass. Better than bronze, cobalt, silver, nickel or brass. Silver, nickel or brass. Living in a high society, living on station. Part of the alliance, the United Federation. Picking up the pieces from the Cardi occupation. You could be a Klingon,